Three, two, one, and we are live on Counterbalance. I'm Mike Duran, and with me today is John Lee from Australia. Hi, John.
Hey Mike, great to be with you.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So, John, you are a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute here in Washington, although you're non-resident, obviously. You live in Australia. You are a former senior national security advisor to the foreign minister in Australia. You're a non-resident senior fellow at the United States Studies Center in Sydney, and you have a PhD from Oxford. Did I get all that right?
You did, and you're correct. I'm based in Sydney. I travel to DC 4, 5, 6 times a year to be with my Hudson colleagues, and that's a great way to see Washington for a short period of time. I go there and then I fly off.
And you are, of course, also one of the leading experts in the world on U.S.-China relations and on Chinese foreign policy in general. Pardon me, I got to fix my screen here. It's a little bit messed up. Um, and I can't think of anyone better to help us understand the China threat these days, and the challenge for the United States of developing a strategy. And that's not just because of your expertise, but also from the fact that you're an Australian, because Australia has already, I think, had to think through all these really hard questions that China presents us with. Perhaps I would think, and I'm asking this as a question, do you think that Australia has gone further than the United States in thinking through the China threat?
It has for one reason, one main reason, and that is that we are in the region and we're not a superpower. That means that we have to consider very carefully what China's actions and policies mean for us, mean for our region, and the way we conduct our lives. I often, when I go to United States, I often think how great it is to be a superpower, because as a superpower, even though you have global responsibilities, you have the capability to absorb a lot of pain and to give or deliver a lot of pain. As a medium-sized power, we don't have those capabilities. We don't have that kind of resilience. We have to try to be a bit more agile when we have a power like the People's Republic of China at our doorstep.
You know, I read a book recently that had a really big influence on me called Silent Invasion by Clive Hamilton. I'm sure you're familiar with it. He described the efforts, what he said was a strategy by China to take over Australia or turn it into a tribute state, was the phrase he used, and to break the Australian-U.S. alliance. Uh, how how accurate do you think that book was?
Well, Clive Hamilton's book described, as you mentioned, a comprehensive approach by the Chinese, or you would even call it a strategy in a proper sense of the word, a comprehensive strategy by the Chinese to infiltrate our institutions, infiltrate many of our stakeholders, our community groups, even our politics, and to use that infiltration to move Australia in a direction that will be more favorable for the Chinese Communist Party. Uh, when Clive's book was released, and I remember it because I was still serving government at the time, there was quite a bit of apprehension, particularly within our bureaucracy, about how the Chinese would respond to this book. And I hadn't read it at the time. And I remember saying to my boss, the then foreign minister, well, if what Clive is saying is true, then I think we need to take it seriously. If what he's saying is a load of garbage, then I think it will die. It will subside. It will die. Well, the book is still there and it's still widely read. And Clive is correct that the Chinese Communist Party does have a comprehensive strategy to infiltrate our institutions. It has achieved quite a fair bit. It hasn't infiltrated our politics as much as I think the Communist Party would like, but it has certainly infiltrated our business community, our universities in particular, and also the community groups that are associated with our diaspora and Chinese language media in our country. My only gripe with the book by Hamilton is that I don't think the Chinese have been as successful as Clive puts it in his book. I think if China is as successful as Clive puts it, they would love it. You know, they would be absolutely elated. They haven't been as successful as the book as the book tells us, but I think the book is useful. It's more than useful because what it says the Chinese Communist Party is trying to achieve, it is what the Communist Party is trying to achieve.
Can you just walk us through? You gave a great overview there, but can you just walk us through some of the details of the strategy? Because this is what I found so interesting, is that we haven't ever encountered before an authoritarian capitalist adversary or rival that's using these economic tools to for clear strategic benefit, and to gain military advantage. And I wonder if you could just walk us through the how Hamilton presents it, or if you have your own view, how you would understand their the key elements of their strategy.
You know, before Clive Hamilton presented his book, lots of individual Australians had encountered instances where they would be subject to either Chinese coercion or Chinese largesse in return for something very specific, in return for some sort of specific favor, or an implied threat by the Chinese individual or the Chinese entity that if you don't do this or say this or not say this, X will happen. I think what Hamilton's book, or the contribution of Hamilton's book, was to show that this was not just a group of rogue individuals that were particularly patriotic to People's Republic of China and loyal to the Chinese Communist Party. It arises out of a systematic, not just strategy, but a systematic policy funded, thought through, executed by government agencies within the People's Republic of China to try to either intimidate or sway or seduce individuals and entities and institutions in Australia to move in a particular direction. So it's really the coordinated nature of it, which I think shocked quite a few people. And just to give you one example, or just to outline really what Clive is talking about, he's really talking about the United Front of the Chinese Communist Party. And one of the aims of the United Front is to activate the diasporas in various countries and to win influence amongst influential stakeholders and organizations within target countries in a way that helps the Chinese Communist Party. Now, the United Front has a budget of many billions of dollars. It has tens of thousands of employees, if you like, of bureaucrats actually working towards that end. So in the United States and Australia, we have the Department of Health, we have the Department of Disease Control, etc. In the People's Republic of China, they have a United Front whose purpose it is to infiltrate mainly liberal democracies. Now that was shocking because this is not just ad hoc lone wolves operating out there. This is something which has been conceived from the very top, implemented, funded, and is actively operating in countries like Australia.
And of course, that's particularly pernicious in liberal democracies like Australia or the United States, where when China works through diaspora communities, it makes it very hard, because if we start saying we have to be wary of diaspora communities, we lay ourselves open to the accusation of being racist or being xenophobic rather than just prudent. It's hard to get that, it's hard to get that message right, so that you actually are not being offensive to Chinese Americans or to Chinese Australians, not being unduly suspicious of them, but yet also recognizing a reality, which is that there is a concerted effort by a bureaucracy in Beijing to manipulate them.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, for pluralistic societies and liberal democracies, where we have a badge of honor that we welcome cultures and races from all around the world, this is a particularly difficult problem. But we should be in no doubt where the problem lies. And I'll give you one widely reported incident, which occurred 2 years ago. 2 years ago, the Australian government was debating whether to ratify an extradition treaty with China, which would allow both countries to the rights of extradition for various criminals, etc. Now, normally that's a very standard thing with many countries, but of course, as we know, in China, the law doesn't operate in the same way, and they were using the extradition treaty with various countries to demand the so-called return of Chinese diasporas for various supposed crimes. So this debate was playing out in Australia as to whether the government should ratify it. And the opposition at the time, I was in government, but the opposition at the time was particularly against ratification of the treaty. The Chinese security czar, so his name was Meng, he's in charge of the whole vast security apparatus in the country. He's probably the fourth or fifth most powerful person in the Chinese system. He visited Australia and he had a meeting with the Labor leader the opposition leader, Bill Shorten. And he said to Bill Shorten, if you don't agree to the ratification of this extradition treaty, I will instruct the 1 million Chinese diasporas in your country to consider the Labor Party an enemy of the People's Republic of China. So these are the 1 million people.
Not very subtle.
No. So these are the 1 million people who are Australian citizens. You know, they're not Chinese citizens. Now, I raised this remarkable incident because we have to apportion blame where blame lies. I think, as you indicated in your comments, it is the Chinese Communist Party who has chosen to politicize race through politicizing diasporas. And it occurred to us in Australia that if we don't get a handle on this problem, then even the mere association with anyone of Chinese descent in Australia will cast aspersions on their loyalty to the country, which will be inherently divisive. This is just one example of why in the last 2 years, Australia has led the world, I think, in passing legislation to outlaw this kind of activity. We could see that this was driving our society apart, and it was amplifying weaknesses in liberal democracies that ought to have been strengths. I think we really had to turn that situation.
Well, that's fascinating. What lessons in terms of writing the legislation do you have for us? How do you write it so that you aren't actually offending every Chinese American?
The legislation itself, in terms of what you outlaw and what you don't outlaw, that's not difficult. You know, there are things that liberal democracies allow, and there are things that we don't allow. So, transparency, for example, the obligation to ensure that whoever gives you money, first of all, you're transparent about that, and secondly, that your actions cannot be determined by those sorts of by largesse, effectively. Writing that legislation is not easy. Sorry, it's not difficult. I think what the Australian government did particularly well was that it launched a very public discussion of this issue before um, even introducing the legislation. And this was important because by launching that public discussion, the Australian population knew or became educated about what the problem was. And so by the time this legislation was launched and eventually passed, the Australian population really knew what to look out for. And that's part of the defense that if the Chinese consulate comes up to you and decides to give you $200,000 to fund a Chinese language newspaper, you have no excuse to to claim ignorance when favors are called upon or when you are leaned against by Beijing. So that public conversation is what I would say is essential and in many respects much more important and effective than actual legislation. You know, there was a time when it became there was a time before when it was socially acceptable to just accept money from various Chinese, either the Chinese government or various Chinese entities, and then put your hands up in the air when you're accused of activities that were not in the national interest. Now it is not socially acceptable, and no individual organization has an excuse to say, "Oh, we weren't aware that this was a trap for us." So by the time the legislation was introduced, um, it was not as the legislation has rarely been applied because I think there's been now a social taboo against these sorts of activities, which is really far more effective than just mere legislation.
Of course, Chinese money that is being used in a strategic way by the Communist Party isn't just coming through official entities. It's also coming through businessmen and even non-Chinese businesses that are doing work with the Chinese. How do you go about countering that influence?
I think part of the public conversation, and you know, I should explain that when I talk about the public conversation, the government and various departments work very closely with responsible journalists. We um, invited them to examine the information. We didn't tell them what to say. We invited them to examine the information, and thankfully, they realised what an issue it was. And for quite a few weeks and months, this was the top foreign relations story in Australia. So the reason why I raise this is that part of the message that was put out to the public is that in the construct of the Chinese Communist Party, which is a very Leninist construct, there is no such thing as public or private. Everything is potentially a tool of the state. So a legitimate Chinese private business might be going about legitimate um, commercial activities, but that doesn't really matter in a sense that the Chinese Communist Party can call upon an entity at any time to do anything at once. So what that meant was it became apparent to many Australian individuals and businesses and organizations that if you are dealing with an entity based in China, even if the people in there were not Chinese Party operatives, they could be called upon by the Communist Chinese Party to do the party's bidding. So that once we realised that, I think there were natural precautions and defences that emerged, which many Australians have taken upon themselves to distance themselves from. And it's not like we don't have significant engagement with Chinese entities and businesses, but I think that everyone is now aware of
Right.
what that means. And if you still choose to make certain decisions against the national interest, then I think you do so with the full knowledge.
Well, that raises a very difficult question. I mean, I think it's a very difficult intellectual question, which I've only really begun to define for myself in the last month or so, and that is, what is the arena of primary competition with the Chinese in this in primary strategic competition. What I mean is that if the Chinese can call on the one hand, the Chinese can call on any economic Chinese economic entity, and on a lot of non-Chinese economic entities that are dependent on them anyway, um, to do whatever they want for strategic effect. Um, but on the other hand, China is so big; its economy is so vast, and it has so many, benign economic activities that it's going to engage in, and also ones that are advantageous to the West to engage in. So there's going to be a high level of economic engagement with China just by virtue of China's size and our own self-interest. But then we have to figure out which are the arenas where we cannot allow ourselves to be intertwined. It's coming up now since the COVID-19 with the supply chains and certain strategic industries, strategic commodities even, are vulnerable to China. We've before that, of course, we had the Huawei um, 5G question. How has Australia gone through sorting out which are the areas in which we are in very sort of zero sum competition with the Chinese? Which are the ones that are we need to be looked at carefully, and which are the ones that we don't care about?
We are going through that process, but I would summarize the Australian thinking, and it's not like we have a document that summarizes it. This is my summary of how, as a whole, we're thinking about this. For sectors and industries that are yet to reach their potential. So emerging industries. So we're talking about 5G. We're talking about artificial intelligence, robotics. Actually, pretty much all the sectors named very conveniently by the Made in China 2025 program, Beijing's blueprint, to
they've they've
dominate the global industries.
they've given us the blueprint of what to worry about.
Well, I mean, I actually think they have. They've actually told us where they think the opportunities are. And they're not just economic opportunities. Of course, they are economic opportunities, but they're not just that. They are opportunities, because they're such new sectors, they are opportunities to define the rules of those sectors,
The global
the
standards.
the standards, the governance, how those sectors actually work, the protocols, those sorts of things. In the existing sectors, broadly speaking, not 90% of the rules and standards have been defined by the West, essentially Europe and the United States. So China realizes that it really can't become it can't provide a dominant framework in a lot of the traditional sectors, even if it becomes dominant in that particular sector in a commercial sense. But in these emerging sectors, they're both economically valuable and will become more so. But they are areas where China thinks that it can define standards. So 5G is the obvious battle at the moment. And Huawei is really not as dominant or as good in 5G as it says, but Huawei can offer a complete package at the moment, which no other company can. And the reason why China is so keen for 5G to be accepted around the world is that if you want to define the standards, presence is half of the battle. If
Uh-huh.
you have a dominance presence, then effectively you will end up defining the standards. So China's effectively rolling out an incomplete product, but it's trying to do that so it can set the rules. Now in Australia, we've realised that, which is one reason why we've been quite forward-leaning, if not the most forward-leaning country, on banning Huawei from 5G. Of course, it was easier for us to do so than, say, the British, because we didn't really have Huawei in our infrastructure
Right.
like the British had. So in a sense, the sunk costs were not so great. But nevertheless, I think Australia got it, that this is a new battleground with almost everything to play for. So to answer your question, I think it's those sorts of sectors that we need to really challenge the Chinese on, and be prepared to endure disruption and even costs to make sure the Chinese don't dominate.
On the question of 5G, what exactly is the threat of 5G? Because I listened to the, I think since COVID-19, I think that the mood has changed in London, but I listened to the debate about whether to ban 5G there. And a lot of very serious people with background in intelligence were recommending to Boris Johnson that he not worry about it too much. We understand what the threat is and we can handle it. Obviously, the Australians came to a different conclusion. So how do you understand the threat, and why should they be more concerned about it?
Sure. The way I understand it, and I have a lot invested in this issue because I was involved in the Australian government's decision to take this stance on Huawei. In previous generation telecommunications, so 4G and below, experts speak about the core and the edge. The core is the central infrastructure, if you like, which you want to protect. And the edge are the applications that attach to that central infrastructure. So for example, under the 4G or 3G network, if you have a mobile phone that taps into a 4G network, the mobile phone is the edge. It doesn't really, it uses the core technology, but it doesn't really interact with the core technology. It really just kind of uses it, and it doesn't communicate or it doesn't interact in any deep sense with the core technology. With 5G, and the whole point of 5G is that everything is interconnected. There is no core technology. So a mobile phone is as critical a piece of the core technology as some $50 million piece of technology that's stored in the telecommunications company that regulates the servers and so on. So the point being that you can access the core, because everything is the core by definition in 5G, even the most innocuous piece of gadgetry can access the core. It is part of the core. And once you're inside the core, it is next to impossible to actually guard against infiltrations. So back to the Huawei issue, one of the reasons why we blocked Huawei is that we cannot have a guarantee that if Huawei is part of the infrastructure, that Huawei will not be able to put so-called backdoors into the infrastructure, which would allow any gadget that knows these backdoors to effectively infiltrate into our system. And the only guarantee we would have is the promise by Huawei that they would never do that. And of course, that's not good enough for such a critical piece of technology. So I'm not a technical person, but that's the best way I can explain why 5G is as contested as it is.
Now, I've heard a lot of discussion about these smart ports that the Chinese are building. And there's a lot of talk about Huawei being involved or directly involved in these smart ports, and concerned that those could become um, intelligence hubs, or sort of collection hubs for the Chinese throughout the world. Is that something that we should be concerned about? Whenever we see that the Chinese are going to run a port or build a port, should we be raising a red flag?
If it's attached to a potential 5G application, then yes. With a 4G application, there are ways of ensuring that doesn't happen. But even then, it's quite expensive and a bit of a burden to do so. So even the British experience with Huawei the Brits may well be correct that they've been able to foolproof their system against uh, breaches by Huawei. But the point is that they have to constantly do it. So, the question is, why actually use a vendor that you don't actually trust, right?
Right.
But with 5G, it becomes even more difficult. One, it becomes even more difficult to work out whether your security has been guaranteed. I mean, you might actually never know that it's been compromised. And the second thing is that the consequences of a breach are far greater with 5G, because if the 5G world actually eventuates, if you have a breach through a 5G system, that puts your water grids in danger, your electricity grids in danger, your traffic lights in danger, government servers in danger, personal data in danger, and so on and so on. I think that's really what's at stake.
Why is it? Why is this issue so difficult? I mean, why can't the United States or some group of countries put together a program to build an alternative to Huawei on the model of the F-35, which is an internet, which is an actual, and there's an international consortium that's building. I don't know if I'm using the right terminology, but it's an international partnership that is building the F-35. Why can't we put together an international partnership to build to create an alternative to the to Huawei, and then begin insisting that if you want to do certain kinds of business with the United States, or with the coalition that is building the alternative, you have to use that product.
We can. It's just that it never occurred to us that we needed to until quite recently. So with Huawei, as I mentioned, Huawei isn't necessarily the leader in every stage or level of 5G technology and 5G and a 5G product. But what Huawei offers is a complete product. That is, Huawei can go into a country and offer a 5G system, if you like, a bells and whistles 5G system that they will implement for you. They will build for you, implement for you. They'll give you the standards. They'll even write the legislation for you as to what sort of telco legislation you actually need for it to occur. The problem we have is that we have companies that have that lead in various aspects of the 5G supply chain, if you like, but they're not coordinated. They're all private companies, and they haven't really coordinated and offered the one integrated product. So we have the capability of doing it, but it does require government intervention. And this is not something which governments have really contemplated was their role for the last decade or 2 decades or so. Incidentally, I think this is where COVID-19 may change mindsets a little bit. That the notion that the government should be an organizing player in the commercial space was anathema to many people and politicians and many groups until quite recently. I think COVID-19 is changing that a little bit.
You think is there an initiative out there to do or talk of what I just suggested, and a government-led effort to organize the private sector to create the total 5G system that could be an alternative to Huawei?
My understanding is that it's your administration, the current American government, is trying to now get together a plan to do just that. So it is speaking to companies and vendors in Europe and Japan to achieve just that. And I think it's early days, but my understanding is that they're quite serious about it. And leading companies from Japan and increasingly in Europe understand the logic of doing that. I think the challenge then becomes one of timing. There are a lot of countries that want a 5G network as quick as possible, and this was Britain's psychology prior to COVID-19. Britain knew the risk, but ultimately it just wanted a 5G network to drive some of the hope for productivity gains in the country. So I think that's a challenge that we do need governments to be patient. They can't be patient forever, but we do need governments to be patient such that this coalition can be cobbled together.
It's remarkable that that as the Chinese began to roll this kind of thing out, no alarm bells seem to have gone off. I mean, I'm asking because I haven't followed the China question that closely, but I mean, they're not they're not they aren't the most subtle actor in all in all of these kind of things, and in some ways they're very subtle, but in other ways they kind of transmit their goals pretty clearly, I think. um, and uh, you know we we see so much evidence that they're using their economic power, that they're using their scientific power in order to achieve very clearly defined national goals, and they're doing it with a very heavy hand, and yet it hasn't the alarm bells haven't gone off. Why do you think that is?
I think part of the problem is that until quite recently, um, industry policy was set by private corporations in the United States, in Australia, in Western countries. And private corporations, as you know, and this is not a cynical criticism, this is really just a reality. Private corporations want to make money. And the Chinese know how to allow private corporations to make money in the short term. In fact, they can engineer that because of the unique authoritarian system.
Hmm.
So private corporations, as you know, at the big firms have been the strongest champions of a soft policy towards China. And the only private corporations that haven't championed a soft approach to China have been the ones that have lost money in China, which are growing in number, but still a lot of companies in the short term are still making money in China. Governments have belatedly realized that you can't fully leave the making of industry policy to private firms. And you're seeing now the battles between the United States government and firms like Google and Facebook, etc. That's because there's a realization now that yes, Google is a national asset, but if a Google or a Facebook or some other company was left to its own devices to make policy, well, in a sense, they're not equipped to make industry policies that have national interest implications.
Right. So you're saying that the Chinese government then acts like a loan shark, comes in and it offers you a lot of money up front, um, front loads it so that it looks to you like a win-win. But then after you get into the relationship, you realize that they've got their hooks into you, and you can't get out without losing everything.
Yeah, I mean that's precisely what the Chinese government and Chinese system does. In my country, in my region, many Americans, when I speak to American government officials, they often complain to me that they don't understand why countries in my region don't see through this. Why don't they prefer the American vision of fair competition, um, rule of law, good standards, all those sorts of things that sound pretty good on paper. And the reason why is because the Chinese are quite unashamedly, the Chinese quite cleverly offer a very different proposition. The Chinese actually say, it is true, there is one rule for China and there's one rule for you. But if you buy into our rules, we can guarantee you benefits.
Mm.
We can guarantee you gains that other countries or other firms won't have. If you buy into the American rules, it is a merit-based competition. There are no guaranteed gains. You may not win. You may get nothing out of this. So you can imagine that unless you are one of the very top companies in the world,
Right, right.
or one of the most powerful countries in the world, This proposition here is far more attractive than many Americans realize. And then you take it to the firm and individual level. Do you want to play by American rules where there are a set of competition and regulations and so on, but they're kind of annoying? Or do you want to play by Chinese rules where you kind of know they're a bit dodgy, but hey, it guarantees your bottom line in 6 months, over the next 6 months or 12 months?
There's a phrase, but by the way, that's fascinating the way you put it, and you put it so clearly. You can see why that would be attractive to many companies, many individuals, many countries. There's a phrase that I see in your writing, which I haven't seen anywhere else. I'm not sure if you're the one who coined it or if you got it from somewhere else, and that's elite capture. And it seems to me that it's another thing that the Chinese can do because corruption is endemic to their system. It's not corruption isn't even corruption. It's just it's the way the system works there. You can't, if you have a communist party controlling private industry, there's going to be a lot of sort of black money changing hands. And so another thing that they can do when making these deals with companies is that, and not just companies, universities, politicians, all kinds of people, they can actually line the pockets of the people who are making the decisions.
I use that phrase because, and I don't know whether others use that phrase, but I use that phrase because I've seen it in action. The Chinese, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't try to, like, it would love to win hearts and minds everywhere, but it realizes that what it really needs to do is win hearts and minds of relevant elites. And particularly in a country like, particularly in many countries in Southeast Asia, for example, where elites, it's very much an elite-driven both economic and political system. You don't have to win the country over. In fact, you look at polls about in Southeast Asia about what they think of China, it's consistently been very poor. But the elites tend to be very pro-Chinese because it's the Chinese that guarantee these elites special privileges, special benefits, inside access. And that's what China does well. I mean, after all, the Chinese Communist Party remains in power because of its capacity for elite capture within its own country. So it understands elite capture well. It can do things which we would consider unethical. And it knows that Western or liberal democracies cannot do elite capture. We can do elite engagement, but we cannot do elite capture in the same way. I have to hand it to the Chinese Communist Party. They have thought very carefully about their strengths and their weaknesses and our strengths and our weaknesses. And they've hatched together approaches which play to their strengths.
No, it's fascinating. What you just said there, I think, is very interesting. Let me recast it, and you tell me if you agree with the statement that the Chinese foreign policy of elite capture is really just an extension of the process by which they have managed China internally. It's a huge country, lots of different regional problems that present themselves to China historically and in the day to day, and so they can only control all of this fractious large country by capturing the elites in all the key in all the key areas. So they're kind of hardwired to think this way, and and they're very sophisticated at it. Is that what you're saying?
Well, Mick, I'm Mike. I'm glad you're not in my field because you said it more eloquently than I have. I'm glad I don't have to compete with you in my field because you said it much more eloquently than I have. Yes, that's correct. If you look at the Chinese Communist Party and how it's remained in power as it's grown richer, as it's reformed aspects of its economy, there are about 95 million, maybe now 100 million members of the Chinese Communist Party. And
It's a country, huge. It's a huge country. The
well,
Chinese
and
Communist
these,
Party. Yeah.
well, correct, but these members are not peasants or farmers. These members are the upper classes. They are the insiders in the country. They are the billionaires and millionaires in the country. As a group, the Chinese Communist Party is the most economically elite group in the country. And that's not by accident. And the point is that the elites, people want to join the Chinese Communist Party because they know that if they join, they get special privileges to stock raisings, to even the best jobs. You know, I've spoken to Chinese students where they wanted to join the party because if you put down your membership number in your CV, you are far more likely to get a good job at one of the huge state-owned firms. Right?
Wow.
I mean, it's as direct as that. So it is all about elite capture. And the reason why they want to do this is because they realize that for them to remain in power, they have to keep the elites and the middle classes on side, right? If you lose the elites and middle classes, and that was a lesson of, as you would know, of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. If you lose the elites, then you're in danger. So you find in the People's Republic of China, the elites, the economic elites, are the strongest supporters of one-party rule, of the authoritarian system. You know, this is very different to the party of Mao in that respect.
So when they saw the Soviet Union fall, they studied that very closely, and they drew the exact opposite conclusions that we did. Not, you know, not that this that we have to that the world must inevitably um, turn to liberal democracy, but rather we have to prevent liberal democracy because it will break us apart the way it broke the Soviet Union apart.
Correctly, you know, the way we view it is that freedom and desire, the individual's desire for liberty, won out in the end, and that's a legitimate, credible interpretation. But the Chinese Communist Party, their interpretation was that the communists in those countries alienated the wrong people.
Uh-huh.
You know, that was their analysis. And look, from a political point of view, they're correct. I mean, you know, they did the communist parties did alienate the wrong people, and they were mocked and derided and effectively rejected by the elites. So when you look at the post Tiananmen Square period, so Tiananmen Square occurs in 1989. There's 3 years where the party's in chaos. And around 92 onwards, the party examines why Tiananmen occurred. And they realized that they were losing their connection with the elites. So what they've done is to ensure that when you reorganize the political economy of China, this is post Tiananmen, so from the 1990s onwards, you've got to ensure that those who benefit most are those who are linked with the Chinese Communist Party. If you don't do that, then you lose power.
That's fascinating. Now, the you've suggest. I mean, I'm reading into what you say, and it seems to me that there's an opportunity here for the West, in that you've suggested that there is at least some way in which the Communist Party feels that it has to be responsive to the needs of the people, at least their economic needs. So then our economic power could be a way of putting pressure on, a serious pressure on the on the Communist Party to to adjust its policy toward us. I mean, seems to be the Trump idea with uh, the trade war and so on. How realistic is that? Do we have the ability to hold the Chinese economy hostage, and or at least pressure the Chinese economically enough to get what we need from them?
When I analyze the mechanics, if you like, of the economic relationship between China and the United States and the economic tools that the United States have, I'm fairly convinced that from a mechanical point of view, the United States has the capacity to ruin the Chinese economy if it really wants. And I know this is quite a bold statement, but to give you one example, China is still heavily reliant on the American dollar and American dollar transactions. if, for example, the United States were to tomorrow freeze 50% of transactions by Chinese entities in American dollars, and most transactions are done in American dollars, and the American government has capacity to do that, the Chinese economy would freeze, right? So that's just one example. Even longer burn aspects, China is still a net importer of technology and innovation from the United States. So, a less drastic measure, the United States government could easily reduce or halt effectively imports of technology and know-how into China through curbs on foreign direct investment into China by American firms, etc. So from a mechanical point of view, the United States has capacity to ruin the Chinese economy, and I don't think China has the same proportionate capacity. But then it becomes a matter of how much cost is the United States prepared to endure, and how much cost is the United States prepared to impose on its allies and friends in executing this. And that's where that that the answer to that question is clearly not simple. But that's where I think the Trump administration has been different to every other administration. The Trump administration has been more prepared to wear costs for America, and also to tolerate collateral damage to allies and partners for certain, to achieve certain purpose. And this is what the trade wars achieved. But we're very early into this trade or economic war, but it's very clear that the United States has a lot more economic leverage than does China. So it's a matter of how far we want to take that and for what purpose.
It seems that from the earlier part of our conversation, um, we should also be thinking about how to make sure that we remain the standard setter in these cutting edge technologies that the Chinese have identified as the key to their future success. Do you think the Trump administration or any Western government has put adequate thinking into that? How to remain the standard bearer?
I certainly think the Trump administration, from my dealings with them, have put a lot of thought in. Well, they recognize the importance of remaining the standard bearer, or becoming the standard bearer for future industries. I personally think that this administration, on a whole, understands that better than previous administrations, and I dealt with the Obama one as well. But the question of how do you do that, I think we're at a very early stage. I mean, one of the answers to how do you do that, as we discussed earlier, you've got to have a dominant presence in those sectors.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't, you can't impose standards effectively. Standards are effectively imposed by the dominant player, or group of players. So we've got to have the dominant players.
One of the things that bothers me personally um, is because I have a background in academia, and I have always been troubled by the lack of any kind of nationalist ethos on American campuses. Just the lack of a sense that that the academic system is part of a national system, and that national power and national assets should be something that's on their mind. Um, so one of the things that bothers me is the infiltration, I would call it, of universities by China. And that's one of the reasons why I liked Clive Hamilton's book so much, because he makes this clear that it's a part of a Chinese strategy to infiltrate the universities, and in particular to take scientific know-how out of Western universities and transfer it to China. And we see, in the case of the Harvard professor who was building the biology lab, I think it was, the name escapes me at the moment. They engaged in elite capture. I mean, they wanted the technology, and they lined his pockets, and he lied about it. How How concerned are you? How big of an issue is that to your mind? And has Australia thought it through?
It's an enormous issue. The it's as Hamilton argues, and it has been demonstrated by quite a few studies. The Chinese specifically target leading Western universities for collaborations. And the way their collaborations work is that if you're an academic, they will say, oh, you're applying for a research grant with, I don't know what you call it in the United States, but, with the United States government. Oh, it's an 18-month process. Oh, we can fast track a grant that's 3 times larger in 1 month, right? If you work with some of our researchers, right? So often it may not even be that you're lining your pockets. It's that you're, as an academic or as a researcher, you're really excited that you finally got the funding and support to do this work that you love doing.
Right.
And then there's the sort of academic cultural aspects which you raise. And in academia, there is this notion that they are not there to serve the nation.
No,
In fact,
they're serving humanity.
yeah, exactly. In fact, they're quite cynical about their own governments, and they see their role to be critics of the government. That is the dominant cultural ethos of particularly Western academics.
Right.
And if you're a Western academic, you have invested your identity in being critical of your own government. You are not that much invested in being critical of the Chinese government.
Right.
So if the Chinese government comes to you and offers you a project, there's no sort of inner hesitation in you to accept that. And as I mentioned, you may not think that you are compromising a national interest. It's just that you are doing research with peers in China who seem to be more supportive of your work than is the American system.
Not, it's not you're actually, given the prevailing ethos in academia, you actually see yourself as virtuous because you are reaching beyond the boundaries of your culture to another culture, working together toward a common enterprise. You're an internationalist. You're cosmopolitan. You're not like those narrow-minded racist rubes in your own society who don't understand how important your work is to humanity. So
Oh,
self-interest and idealism combine perfectly and seamlessly to encourage you to take Chinese money.
well, I mean, I completely agree. If you have that ethos and you're given that the false choice of bettering humanity or bettering America, you will choose bettering humanity, right? And
Bettering
you do that
humanity
by
and getting rich at the same time. And then you add to that I gather the Chinese students that you're working with are exceptionally good, particularly in the sciences and engineering and so on. They're exceptionally good and they're exceptionally hardworking, and they know that their own families, they're incredibly motivated because they know that their own family's livelihood depends on their success, and their family will mobilize around them to make sure that they succeed. So if you're a professor and working in molecular biology or quantum physics, and you have these Chinese students, they will work for you 24/7 to pump out papers that have your name on it. And so it's another aspect of the attraction of working with China. It's not that you're not going off to some place that is doesn't have adequate facilities or talented people to work with.
Oh, I think you've touched on something there. I've heard many academic friends who have taught in China or done research in China come back and tell me that, oh my God, it's great because the students really listen to you. They really respect you. They really respect their field, and their peers and their families really respect what they do. and then they come back to Australia and no one really cares what they do. It's not that prestigious, right? So there is a real, I mean, we trivialized it in some senses, but it's a real issue. Academics do go to China and come back and say, I had such, not just a great time, but it was so fulfilling because what I did felt meaningful,
So,
which
so,
doesn't occur a lot back in the United States, Australia.
so has Australia worked to counter that in any way? And do you have any ideas about how to counter it?
Um, you, you, you know, there's always suggestions that the Australian government should give more money to Australian researchers, and that's all true. That should happen. But the reality is that from a monetary point of view, Western governments or democratic governments don't work that way. They can't just give money to researchers without any due process, right? That's just not what they can do.
Right.
Um, from the Australian experience, going back to an early part of our conversation, one of the most effective things just has been to publicize that when you do a research collaboration with China, you are doing a research collaboration with the Chinese Communist Party of China, even if your collaborators are not members of the party. And I think our media and many of our experts have entered that conversation and explained that to our publics very well. And as I mentioned, there is nothing to prevent an Australian academic from still going to China, but it is now not as socially praised as it was a few years ago.
I wonder. I don't know what's your impression of the situation in the United States in that regard. If you look at at the reaction when Trump tried to call the COVID-19 the Wuhan flu or the China virus, and when he shut down flights from China, the cry went up that he was racist, and I think that's sort of hardwired into our politics now, that any initiative that comes from the White House in these sorts of areas is going to, particularly if it touches on academic freedom, uh,
Mm,
is going to have a backlash, and it's going to say this is a narrow-minded, bigoted response, a xenophobic response. Um, do you agree with that, or are you seeing a sort of similar um, rising consciousness I'm talking about among academics in particular in the United States, that doing business with China is actually a little unseemly?
I don't think the United States is in the same position as Australia, because I don't think the United States has had the same depth of national conversation about China as Australia. Now, in defense of the United States, I mean, your country is a far larger country with many, many issues to think about, global issues to think about. In Australia, there's only one issue to think about for us, and it's China, or
Yeah.
US China. So to dominate the national conversation in Australia is far easier than it is in the United States. Incidentally, I just wanted to give you a sort of practical example. In Australia, there's only 2 national newspapers, right? So if you want to get a message across to the whole nation, and it's a small nation by population, it's 25 million people, you want to get a message to the whole nation, you just have to publish in 1 or 2 newspapers.
Right.
The United States doesn't work like that, obviously.
No. No.
So I think it's far more difficult in your country to have a national conversation. And when it comes to this particular issue, unfortunately, your current president is so polarizing that even if he speaks the gospel truth, he will be attacked.
Right.
I publicly supported his use of the term Wuhan coronavirus. There were strong reasons to do that. But because Donald Trump said it, it's automatically rejected by half of the commentators, or more than half of the commentators in your country. In that situation, it's, if possible, it's always best that these sorts of arguments be made by non-government people. And look, we found in Australia, if the Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister had just stood up and kept on going on about the dangers of China, it just wouldn't have had the same effect. You really needed other people to get on board and publish their views prominently, like Clive Hamilton, for example.
I think we should probably, I could talk to you for hours about this. So fascinating. I should probably bring this to an end, but let's bring it back to Hamilton, since you just mentioned him. Is there, to your knowledge, is there anything like Hamilton's book about China and the United States? Has anyone surveyed the total universe of activities that the Communist Party is engaged in inside the United States to capture American elites, line the pockets of politicians, businessmen, cultural figures, toward a specific goal?
Not that I'm aware of. It could be an opportunity for us, but not that I'm aware of. Is there such a book or a document or even an article that surveys, as you mentioned, a comprehensively what the Chinese Communist Party is trying to achieve and what they're up to?
It really needs to be done. I think the if the Chinese Communist Party in 2004 sat down and developed a strategy for turning Australia into a tribute state, you can be sure that they sat down and developed a strategy toward the United States. And we might sit down and look at all of these activities and say, well, what exactly is the goal? I bet it wouldn't be that hard. It'd be quite interesting. I I suggest that you should do that.
Well,
It'll make you really popular. It'll make you really popular on American campuses.
Well, it will get me probably twice banned from China, but that's probably a worthy cause.
You've been banned from China?
I haven't been officially banned from China, but I imagine it'd be quite difficult for me to get a visa to visit China right now.
Yeah, I wouldn't. If I were you, even if they gave you one, I wouldn't go. You might not come back.
No, unfortunately for me, I'm not important enough to be protected, so I do have to be careful about these sorts of things.
Well, this is the fastest growing television channel in America. So studies show from some of our top universities that this is the fastest growing channel. So who knows? Maybe tomorrow you'll be the best known person in China.
No, well, I appreciate you having me on. It's been really good to chat, and I can't wait till the next time I'm back in DC, whenever that will be.
Yeah, well, really, thank you. I always benefit greatly from your insights. I really appreciate it, and I hope you'll come back.
Oh, it will be my pleasure too. Thank you for having me.
Bye bye. Take care.